everyone. My name's Steve Brent, and I'm the Chief Executive of the International House Trust, based here at International House London. A very warm welcome to everyone in the room and to all of those joining us online. Throughout the team at the International House World Organization has been organizing a whole series of events and activities to celebrate 60 years of language teaching and teacher training at international house schools around the world. No small undertaking, given that we've now got 155 schools in over 50 countries. And this two-day educational online is one of those events. And the first day, yesterday, showcased a lot of the talent that we currently have within our network. And today, I'm delighted that we've got such a distinguished lineup of speakers, all of whom have a strong connection with International House, none more so, of course, than Brita Haycraft, our joint founder. Now, to take you through today's programme, I'm delighted to hand you over to Simon Greenall. Simon, most of you will know as a talented writer and a conference speaker. I know him best as a very generous and hard-working trustee. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Steve and I had a discussion about how we'd organise our double act. We didn't know whether it was going to be Morecambe and Wise or Cagney and Lacey or Split. As it turned out, it's more sort of Blackadder and Walter. One of the things you forgot to mention is that we have to point out that the fire exits down that way. It's a great privilege to introduce the speakers today. It's not just a celebration of English, it's a celebration of all the languages that we teach around the world. As Steve said, we've had a series of celebrations all year. Last week we had the great pleasure of being in International House Cordoba, which was where the very first school was created. We had a wonderful weekend there with a magnificent celebration, and we're very grateful to the Cremades family who organised that. But now we've reached the end of the year and the end of our anniversary celebrations. So, as Steve said, this is the second day of a two-day conference. Yesterday, our speakers were from IH schools in Dubai, Coimbra, London, Bristol, Milan, Buenos Aires, Recoleta, and Cordoba. And as Steve suggested, we've got two kinds of audience here. We've got an online audience who are joining in by the power of technology all over the world, and an audience here of the good and great of English language teaching. So for those of you who are joining in online, we'd love to hear comments and questions. And if you want to give a virtual hello on Twitter, we're using the hashtag IH60Live. So do join us by Twitter. There will be opportunities for asking and answering questions at the end of each session, and some of them we can deal with on Twitter. We've got about 70 guests here in London today, and we've also got a number of IH schools who are actually grouping together, coming together in the classroom somewhere around the world. I've got the first hello that I need to say to the teachers at International House San Sebastian. Javier Lacunza was with us in Cordoba last week. Emma Heidemann, I believe, is the DOS there, and I just wanted to say hello to them. Let's move on to today's event. When Brita was presented with her Lifetime's Achievement Award at the British Council Eltons, she asked people to put their hand up if they had experienced any form of IH training. And what was amazing was that pretty well everybody in a hall of about 300 or 400 people put their hands up. And it just goes to demonstrate the influence that International House has had on English language teaching and language teaching around the world. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that without International House, there would be no ELT profession today. So any conference would be privileged to have just one of today's speakers. The fact we have 7, and the fact that they're all very closely linked with International House, is, I think, a testament to the incredible work that International House does. And of course to John and Brita, who set it all up. Our first speaker today is Scott, who is in Barcelona, and I'm not sure if you can see Scott. Apparently Scott can hear me, but he can't reply. And that's for technological reasons. So, and this is such a tempting offer, and maybe I just ought to say, Scott, what is this business about Dogme? What's it about? You're just winging it, aren't you? And he can't answer back. Scott is currently curriculum coordinator on the MA T-Cell program at the New School in New York. He spent his entire EFL career before that with International House in the UK, Egypt, Spain, and has visited scores of affiliates worldwide. So Scott is our first speaker, a colleague and a dear friend of many of us at International House. And I hope he's online right now. Hello, Scott.
It's a great occasion, the 60th anniversary of International House, and I have a hugely vested interest in this anniversary. I calculate that I've been working a half of those 60 years for International House, nearly 30 in fact, in various places around the world. And I can honestly say, hand on heart, you can see me, that everything I've learned about teaching and teacher training, I've learned in International House. So it's really an enormous pleasure to be able to kick off today's conferencing, and a special shout out to Brita if you're there in the audience. I can't see the audience, Brita, but it's all credit to you and John that you've set this up and maintained it over all these years. It's a wonderful institution. As I say, I'm very proud. And everything I've learned, yes, I've learned in International House, and I think one of the things I learned was how to get how to do more with less, essentially. Barcelona, particularly with my colleague Neil Forrest, that was very much our kind of mantra, do more with less. And it, out of that, in a sense, developed the whole Dogme, what's now called Dogme project, which I'm not going to trace the history of that, most of you will know it, but that's been running now for something like 13 or 14 years. And I like to think that, in a sense, that the idea of doing more with less is very much part of the International House philosophy, or certainly it was when it started. I don't think when John and Brita started in Cordoba so many years ago that they had, probably didn't even have course books, let alone interactive whiteboards and tablets and so on, and yet I don't think their teaching was any the worse for that. And as I say, the working with Neil and IH Barcelona on our, particularly on the diploma program, we learnt that some of the best lessons were those that were created, as it were, out of the what was available in the room itself. And hence, that was how Dogme, in a sense, emerged. Nevertheless, of course, it's had its critics, and the criticisms have been well aired right since the inception, and have been answered extensively on websites and blogs and in the literature. So I'm not here to address those particular criticisms. All I would say is that the idea of doing more with less is a fairly uncontroversial notion, and one that is very generalizable to a wide range of contexts. But what I would like to do today is I'd like to address not the critical non-adopters of dogma, because they'll never come on board and they'll always be critical. So, you know, I leave them aside. I'm more interested in the non-critical adopters, those people, many of you out there, no doubt, who have adopted or had already adopted principles which are germane to a dogma or teaching unplugged approach, are using those in your classes, but maybe a little uncritically. And I think with any methodology that anybody adapts, you've got to have your crap detector turned on high. And I think that applies just as much to dogma as to anything. So as I say, I'm speaking to the non-critical adopters today. And it seems to me that there are some problems very much inherent in the kind of dogma approach as it's been outlined, particularly in Luke Medding's and my book, Teaching Unplugged. Or at least there are some weaknesses in the interpretation of the kind of original dogma, as it were, theory. And one of these, the single biggest problem to me seems to be the problem of the lack of input. This is Michael Swan's main criticism of task-based learning. So it's not surprising in a sense that the same criticism can be levelled at dogma, since dogma in a sense is a kind of an extension of a task-based approach. Quoting from Michael's book, I can't recommend it highly enough, the collection of his papers published last year by Oxford University Press. He asked, you know, in task-based instruction, and he comments, he says, if one was seeking an efficient way of improving one's elementary command of a foreign language, sustained conversation and linguistic speculation with other elementary learners would scarcely be one's first choice. And this is a criticism, I think, which could be levelled at dogma. A lot of people in the room having fun, talking to each other, but where is the input? Isn't it just recycling what they already know? If language is supposedly emerging, will it? What will emerge? And won't it be, as I say, the endless recycling of the kind of class pool of language? Where is the input plus one, if you like? Where is the zone of proximal development? And that seems to be a fair criticism of a dogma approach. But I think it's based on a misunderstanding, and it's a misunderstanding that I share some blame in perpetuating. In a sense, what we're talking about here, about emergence, it's not the language that emerges magically from the kind of conversation in the classroom. It's the syllabus that emerges. And the syllabus is in turn a function of the learner's own needs, interests, desires, etc. Their needs to communicate, what they want to communicate about, creates, in a sense, an emergent syllabus. The language comes from the teacher, in most cases. It could come from other students. But in a sense, the learner, if you like, the learner needs and the teacher feeds. And the teacher feeds at the point of need. And that's what makes that kind of language work so memorable, because it is so salient and it is so relevant to the point in time when the learners need it. It's not the language which has been, in a sense, digested for them and presented in a course book which may not have any particular relevance at that time. Incidentally, there's a very nice description just yesterday or 2 days ago on my blog. A teacher, I don't know where she is, a teacher called Jenna, answered my question when she was talking about her own emergent classrooms. Where does the language come from? And she describes in detail how she constructs and scaffolds the language that the learners need on the basis of the output that they are producing. So it's not the language so much that is emergent, it's the syllabus that is emergent. It emerges out of the language work that's created by the teacher with the learners in the classroom. It's the teacher who takes this raw material, if you like, and kind of transmutes it into the pure gold, which becomes the content of the lesson and the focus of the learner's learning. But there's another problem associated with that, though. If the syllabus emerges out of the conversations in the room, it's going to be a very conversation-driven syllabus, and in a sense it's going to have a certain register and a certain range of topics which will be limited and not necessarily relevant to the learners who are doing, for example, preparing for an exam class or doing English for special purposes, academic purposes or whatever. There's a certain casualness and an informality associated with conversational language which might not necessarily be appropriate and might not necessarily push the learners enough. But I think that's easily addressed if we, in a sense, again, move the focus away from conversation, which again perhaps was a misnomer, and substitute for the word conversation the word text. Text-driven learning, not textbook-driven learning, but text-driven learning. So there are texts in different registers. If they're preparing for an exam, if they're doing ESP, they're EAP students, then they have texts that either the teachers provided or even better, that the learners themselves have provided, which can provide the language input that Michael Swan sees as missing from a task-based approach. And of course, by changing the kind of task types in the classroom, you can change the register. So it's not just about conversation. I had this experience myself very recently in studying Spanish in an intensive Spanish class at high intermediate level, where the teacher gave us the opportunity to give presentations to the rest of the students. Now these presentations really concentrated the mind. It was a different register altogether. You're standing up in front of the class, but it's still the language that the students have elected to use. I chose the topic, I gave the presentation, the teacher scaffolded, provided the feedback, and the other students in the class with the audience asked questions. But the register slipped up a notch or two, became more formal thereby. There's another point also associated with this thing of dealing with the language that emerges in the classroom. The challenge, I think, for teachers is how to deal with it. And there was a very good talk last year at IATEFL in Liverpool where Andrew Walkley critiqued approaches like Dogme or task-based instruction for relying too much on the teacher's ability to provide the kind of language that might be necessary in the here and now. And I think this is another fair criticism, maybe something else that is, in a sense, wrong with Dogme. There are, when do you provide those interventions, and how? I mean, how do you supply the best reformulation for what the learners want to know? Now, Andrew was arguing that teachers don't have the expertise to be able to pluck out of the air the kind of language that learners need at the time that they need it. That we, in a sense, come too blinkered by our sense of what language is. And that, in a sense, that blinkering, I have to say, does come to a large extent from the experience of just using coursebook syllabuses, which are so obsessively focused on verb, phrase, grammar, at the expense of all sorts of other areas of language, not just grammar, but of course of phraseology. So what teachers tend to do when they're sort of confronted by emergent language in the classroom is focus on the things that they know best: verb phrases, tense mistakes, subject verb agreement problems, and possibly some residual problems with inflections like, possessives and plurals and things like that, omitting whole areas of language which perhaps are more important, more relevant to the learner's particular needs. And this is a problem. Yeah, how do you come up with... Now, Andrew's answer was that you supply this language pre-digested, as I say, in the form of a course book. I don't think that's absolutely necessary. I think it is a challenge, but it's a challenge that any teacher has, irrespective of their methodology. If you're dealing with language that comes up in the classroom, if you're asking learners to be creative with language, then of course you're going to have to deal with it in some way. we've long since moved away from such rigid methodologies like audiolingualism, where the students were kind of frog-marched down a narrow language track whereby they were not allowed to diverge. Now, of course, we're in a kind of communicative paradigm. We encourage learner production and creativity at every stage of the lesson. And as teachers, we learn how to deal with this. We have to learn how to deal with it. And maybe it's a responsibility in our training programs to help learners, to help teachers become more able to cope, as it were, with these in-flight decisions as to how to reformulate language. What is the best way of reformulating? How can we look at language in ways which are not purely focused on verbs, for example? So it does go back, I think, to the training room to a large extent. But as I say, teachers who are kind of in a sense trained only on coursebook grammar will perhaps find it harder to kind of hear the kind of problems that their learners are having. So as I said, then any methodology that places any kind of premium on learner creativity is going to require that teachers think on their feet. It's just that Dogme does this almost as a part. It's a defining characteristic of a Dogme approach. But of course, now we have technology in the classroom where technology can be really useful, as being able to act as a resource. If you're in a smart classroom, you can go immediately to an online corpus. You can find the stuff that it is the learners need, or you get them to find it relatively rapidly. So the time lag between the teacher having to make a decision, which might have been, say, well, I'll have to come back to you on that tomorrow, or let's have a look in a grammar or a dictionary, the time lag can be a lot shorter. So those are what I would then say are the problems of Dogme. The problems, that's what's wrong with it. And just to recap, the problem of where does the input come from? And the problem of how is the learner's language shaped to become input plus one, as it were, or output plus one. Where is the push? And how can we guarantee that push will be a broad spectrum kind of push in terms of how the teacher deals with learner language? And I think there are answers to those questions, and I don't think necessarily it requires that the teacher be hugely experienced or a native speaker of the language. This can give particular advantages in some aspects, but not necessarily others. After all, Dogme as an approach is basically centered on a kind of the ability to create a rapport and a good class dynamic, and to, the sine qua non of the whole approach is to get language going in the classroom, which is a management issue and a social issue. And even teachers with very little experience, or non-native teachers, have no trouble doing that in my experience. How you deal with the language as it comes up, of course, as I say, is a challenge, but it's not something that can't be addressed in teacher training classrooms. So, to summarize then, is Dogme flawed? Well, it's not perfect. No method is. And it requires resourceful teachers to adapt the principles to the particular context they're working in. But I would say, in balance, that the benefits that accrue from adopting a more student-centered approach, and one that, in a sense, sidelines imported materials, the benefits outweigh the weaknesses. And the weaknesses, moreover, are weaknesses that a vigilant and responsive and resourceful teacher, that's to say an international house teacher, can easily overcome. So on that note, I'll finish and allow time for, we've got 10 minutes for questions which will be fed to me, hopefully via Skype. Okay. So, as I say, I'm staring into a void here. I'm assuming there's still people in the room and there's people out there.
So the question
in
for you,
cyberspace,
so that's
and now I'm awaiting
I've got the question from the live stream. So the live stream question is, how can we motivate the experienced teacher who is possibly overworked or simply downright lazy to think outside the course book? So she's got to type that in. Just talk amongst yourselves in for a moment. Motivate the experienced teacher who is possibly overworked or simply downright lazy to think outside the course book.
It's a long one.
How did he know that? You can see the pen there.
Lazy to?
To think outside the course book.
I'm feverish with anticipation.
And who says that?
Claire. You ready for the next one?
What happened to cut and paste?
Oh yeah, good point. Why can't I just get Scott?
Yeah.
Is it in the same one?
Okay.
I'll add you to.
This is like the advent of Morse code. Here we go. How can we motivate the experienced teacher who is possibly overworked or downright lazy to think outside the course book? I don't think that's a dogma issue. That's an in-service training issue generally. I mean, one of the things that we found on our diploma courses in Barcelona, I think in a sense which motivated us to kind of push the learners, the trainee teachers to work outside the box, was the fact that what was kind of disappointing was that teachers that we'd trained on certificate courses, who then came back to us 3 or 4 years later, seemed just as dependent on course books as they had when they left us. And this seemed to be a shame in the sense that they had not taken that leap, which I think is most teachers self-directed in their own development tend to take at some point, and often are forced to by, accidents, like, the photocopier wasn't working that day, or the lights went out, or I was substituting for somebody who hadn't left a lesson plan. We become very resourceful, and we discover the huge benefits from being resourceful. One of the things that kind of pushed me, going back into my history at International House, when I first was working as the Director of Studies in the IH school in Cairo, we had, quite a lot of illness, and I had to go in and substitute quite often, and I learned then how to kind of think on my feet. So how can we motivate this experienced teacher? Well, I suppose you could turn the power off. No, I'm joking. But I think people underestimate their own capacity to think on their feet. And I think, again, as part of a training program, I would suggest, even on a certificate course, to say, let's have one day of teaching practice when you just go in and deal with what happens. And you'll discover that, nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the classroom. Somebody will fill it, even if it's the students, especially if it's the students.
Yeah, got it. Here we go.
Parties, we sit on a plane next time. Most people have the capacity to sort of engage with other people that they don't know. So they're not necessarily...
He is actually...
maybe not. Hang on. Don't you love it? This is the first webinar I'm doing today. I'm doing another one in half an hour. So it's almost like webinars are starting to replace conference travel, which is not a bad thing, ecologically speaking, but I do miss the crack. Are there any other questions? Where am I not looking? Heike, have you got a question? No.
Well, I'm thinking.
Okay. Here we go. Aha. Sean says, in the dogma setting, how does learning, even acquisition, take place? Well, I thought I'd answered that. I mean, how does learning take place in any classroom context? It actually takes place when things happen that connect with your immediate needs, not to somebody's preconception of what those needs are. We remember the stuff that happens at the point of need. That's why correction is really useful. And on-the-spot correction or feedback is really useful, whether negative or positive. We don't know how acquisition takes place, but probably acquisition takes place when attention and awareness are heightened. And attention and awareness are heightened when things seem relevant to you as a person. And things will seem relevant to you as a person if they're things that you have already voiced, where you have some agency in the process. That's where acquisition is most likely to take place. Okay, another question. Is it the dogma if the teacher brings a text from an exam? So of course, we're talking about an approach which meets the needs of the learners and doesn't try to anticipate these through some kind of pre-designed syllabus or text. The text, if the learners are doing an exam, then surely it's in their needs and interests to look at exam papers. I see no problem with bringing that in or making them available online. That would seem to be an obvious thing to do, but it's not. It's a direct response to what you perceive and what the learners tell you that they need. Even better if they attempt to design an exam paper themselves. They might understand something about the mechanics of them. Did Scott just call dogma a method? Well, I mean, I call it a method in lieu of any other better word, simply because it never was intended to be a method. As those of you who know the history, it was a metaphor, if anything, that described a kind of way of teaching that most teachers, expert teachers, have already discovered. I gave it a name, we gave it a name simply in order to validate it so that people who have felt guilty about going in and, as it were, winging it should not feel guilty. Could 100% dogma syllabus work? Yes, it does work. It works all the time. It works in a lot of one-to-one teaching. If I'm teaching somebody one-to-one, I ask them what it is that you need to be able to do at the end of this process, and then we'll work back from there. That's a dogma syllabus. And applying that to a classroom, of course, is more complicated because you have a variety of needs. But it's not impossible to reach a consensus amongst your learners as it is to what they perceive are their needs. I mean, this is particularly the case if they are in an ESL environment, for example. I mean, EFL, young learners EFL, you clearly got, and 40 students in a class, you're clearly going to get a problem getting any kind of consensus as to what their needs are. But you can at least find out what their interests are and work from those. And they'd be very happy to tell you. Could 100%, would it be desirable? Yeah. Any other questions? We've got 2 more minutes before I am kind of removed from here. Well, in the absence of any other questions, let me just reiterate my joy at the occasion of International House's 60th anniversary. Once again, I mean, I just hope you're there, Rita. I wish I could see you. Big cyber hug from me, and to all of you, both in the room in London and following on the live stream, then have a great day and join me in celebrating this wonderful anniversary. And on that note, I think with perfect timing, I shall now sign out. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Heike and the team, for